Now I have to pick up where you left off. Yes, you have us primed and set up. The next person that I would like to introduce is historic romance novelist Susan Gee Heino. Yes, I said it right. Heino has got me. Susan is the wife of a rural minister, and she's a mom. She received the Romance Writers of America's Golden Heart Award and the Regency Historical category for Mistress By Mistake. And isn't the Golden Heart for your first novel?
It's actually for unpublished.
For unpublished.
Manuscript before it was sold.
So then it was picked up and sold,
Yeah.
and is now a book. Her latest book, Temptress in Training. I love so many of the romance books because I like reading them, but if you can listen to them on CD or tape, you just see the wonderful play on words that these writers create for us, and it's just so much fun. But with that, I'm going to introduce Susan and ask her to read from your last,
My latest release is
Okay.
out currently, Damsel in Distress, the one with the purple cover. We color code everything.
That's right. I am Susan Gee Heino, and I've been in Ohio since the early 90s, however long that's been. I was 2. And I also have a theater background. Woohoo! Hey, would you read half of this with me?
We're just going to hire her to read it.
I know. I do, however, not presume to adopt a British accent because I came to Ohio via Kentucky. So I can do accents, but not this kind. I can write with a British accent. I cannot read with one. So you're going to have to imagine. I write during I write nowadays, but I write about characters and storylines set during the Regency time period in England, which is a few years before her beloved Victorian. My first 3 books of this current series take place all in 1816, because that's the year I like. Yep. And then you only have to research 1 year, and by God, things are so much nicer. But the research aspect of writing historicals is, I think, one of the things that an awful lot of romance writers say, oh, I could never do that, I want to write contemporary. Then these ladies add all this paranormal stuff, so they just make it up. You know? I'm going to do that next because this current series has no paranormal activity, so I had to rely on what really existed, although I made up a lot of stuff in the book that comes out this summer. So clothing-wise, because they just didn't have some of that stuff then, and my gal needed it. Anyway, this book, however, is it's not a sequel, but it's a follow-up to my first book. It happens concurrently with the storyline in the first book, as does the third book. They're all happening kind of at the same time, following different people. And this book in particular, being the middle one of that series, was a little difficult to write because I couldn't finish up some of the important storylines because I had to keep some things open to deal with in the third book. And I didn't want to answer too many questions that were still needing to be left unanswered so that the third book would be interesting. But at the same time, I had to answer enough questions that when you get done reading this, you feel like, oh, I know what's going on. So that's kind of a challenge that I didn't really think through until I had already committed myself. And my fourth book that I'm working on now, I just decided it happens 5 years later. So now I know about 1822. But the storyline, I'll set it up for you here. My heroine is Julia. She is an actress. Amazing. During the Regency time period, which is the early part of the 1800s, you don't need a history lesson, but just to kind of put a pin in it, think of Jane Austen. You know, I'm sure everybody has been privileged to sit through 5 or 6 renditions of Pride and Prejudice or something. That's the clothes they're wearing. That's the time period. Actually, mine is slightly later, but it's just a matter of a couple of years. So that's what we're thinking of when we're picturing these people. We don't have bustles. We don't have fancy tall hats with, things like that. It's different time period, and there's no trains, and it's a lot happens between the Regency and the full-blown Victorian era. And so even though we are both writing books set in England in the 1800s, they're pretty much a world apart, even despite the paranormal elements. So although none of that will show up in the tiny little snippet that I chose to read today. My heroine, Julia, the actress, formerly was lovers with Lord Anthony Rathmore. Although I suppose he would be Antony, but I'm not doing that. But 3 years ago, they had this torrid affair. He wanted to marry her. She was game to go for it. But he has this evil bastard cousin. He really is a bastard, not like a jerk. I mean, he's cut off of the family, and he's jealous that Anthony has all the money and, all the girls love him. So he determines to make Anthony's life miserable, and he plots to steal her away and marry her for himself, which is what Anthony believes happened, and then he believes that she died giving birth to this other man's child. So for 3 years, he's just been miserable, grieving over his actress that he lost, and feeling like an idiot for having fallen for her charms to begin with. Well, she really is not dead. She's been hiding from the evil cousin. She never did marry him. But if he finds her, he will destroy her and her father, who has an acting company, and they're no longer allowed in the legitimate theater in London. You had to have vouchers and stuff that, you had to prove that you were worthy, and so they got all that revoked. And so they're kind of having to scrape, whereas before they'd been doing pretty good for themselves. So the past 3 years have been rough on her. They're hiding from this evil cousin. Everybody has to think she's still dead. Well, now she's uncovered a plot. The cousin has had enough. He's going to murder our hero. And Julia has to make a decision. Is she going to come forward and let the hero know that she's still alive and warn him so that his life will be saved? Or is she going to just keep hiding so that she will be safe? What she decides to do is neither. She decides to disguise herself as a man and secretly warn Anthony so that he gets the warning, but it's anonymous, and he has no idea that Julia is still amongst the living for real. And so what she's doing at this point, this is toward the beginning of the book, she and her friend Sophie, who's the gal with the fancy underwear in the third book, they are traveling incognito, and Sophie is pretending to be a wife, and Julia is pretending to be the husband, and neither of them are very good at it. But they're just trying to keep a low profile, and they're stopped to eat dinner while they're traveling on the road. And someone arrives at the posting house where they are dining. And that's what we will see. Throw that around somewhere. Kentucky Accent by Jane Austen. I can't wait to see this Lord Rassmore's face when he meets you again, Sophie was saying as they finished their supper. Julia cringed. Hopefully that will never happen. With luck, we'll find he's safely at Lord Dashford's home, and I can simply send a warning message. And then he'll find out that Fitzgelder is after him, and you and I can be off to meet Papa. But you don't want to see him again? Oh, heavens, no. Well, we've come all this way, and you're not even going to see the man? Exactly. Oh, Sophie was downcast. That's so sad. I was hoping the two of you might... I'm sorry, Sophie. That only happens in novels. It was a shame to disappoint the poor girl, but better she get such foolishness out of her mind now before she started expecting grand romance for her own life. Indeed, women like them should harbor no such hopes. Julia had learned that the hard way. Perhaps the truth would come easier for Sophie. We'll be done with this before you know it, Julia went on, hoping her light tone and warm smile would both encourage and distract her younger friend. Well, then we'll find Papa, and you'll become a part of our troupe. You're quite a hand at sewing, and perhaps we can coax you into acting as well. Acting? Oh, I'm sure I could never be so very good at that. All those lines I'd have to memorize. You've been play acting the part of a blushing bride for 3 days now, and so far the audience seems quite enthralled, Julia said, sweeping her arm wide to indicate the patrons of the posting house, a few of whom had traveled this last leg of the journey on the mail coach with them. Sophie looked around the dim room and frowned. I believe our audience would be no less enthralled were I simply a chicken tucked under your arm. They've hardly taken note of us at all. There, you see, you've played your part to perfection. Who's to say you might not make a memorable Juliet or Ophelia or Lord Lindley, Sophie said suddenly. Lord Lindley? I don't believe we have any scripts with him. But then Julia glanced up, and she realized what Sophie meant. The doorway was filled with the elegant form of a man they had briefly met in London just as they were making their hasty escape. Lord Lindley, a good friend and confidant of the evil Fitzgelder. Sophie's eyes were huge and terrified, and Julia wanted to slide under the table. Good heavens! If Lindley recognized them, he'd notified Fitzgelder of their whereabouts. They had to hide. They had to get out of here this very instant. There was nowhere they could go, nowhere in the room to hide. They were trapped. Julia's pulse pounded, and she struggled to come up with a scheme to protect them. What could she do? Where could they go? Suddenly, all coherent thought ceased. A familiar, broad-shouldered form appeared behind Lindley. Julia's lungs contracted. The air squeezed out of them in a whimper. Around her, the world disappeared, and she was aware of only one thing. Anthony Rassmore was still alive. Thank God she wasn't too late. Fitzgelder's men hadn't succeeded in their plan. Anthony still lived and breathed and wore that smile of half amusement, half boredom she'd come to know so well 3 years ago. 3 long, painful years ago. He was alive and he was beautiful. And he was cold. When his gaze fell on her, she recoiled both inwardly and out. The chill that emanated in his hazel eyes was as unfamiliar as the image that had been greeting her in the mirror since she and Sophie had taken up this masquerade. Indeed, the Anthony Rassmore who followed Lindley into the poorly lit common room was a man much changed from the man who had taken Julia's virtue as well as her heart. Okay, that's all I'm going to do.
Quick question for Susan.
Oh, yeah. Any questions? Okay.
Thank you.